Clinic reject. That's what they called her at the last place. Not to her face, obviously. But it was written on a post-it note that got left on the supply cart. Clinic reject. The kind of insult that sticks because it sounds like a diagnosis, like something broken that couldn't be fixed. Ashley Cooper had seen that note once, photographed it with the same steady hand she used to draw blood, then thrown it away without changing her expression. She didn't flinch then. She wouldn't flinch now. The restricted records room at Mercy General hummed with the sound of fluorescent lights at 11:47 p.m. Ashley stood motionless in front of the file cabinet, her badge hanging against her chest like a talisman. Her fingers, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that came from field work, from doing things hands weren't supposed to do, moved with surgical precision through the clinical trial folders. Trial 2847A, the Dr. Gabriel's signature on every authorization page. Her eye caught the numbers first. Patient outcomes data that didn't match the summary statistics by 34 percentage points. The camera on her phone made a soft click. Then another. And another. She photographed each page with the same methodical efficiency she brought to every task, no hesitation, no second-guessing, no trembling of her hands under pressure. Her hands had held pressure before. Much worse pressure. They knew how to stay steady when everything around them wanted to collapse. She had learned that in Kandahar, where the heat made you see things that weren't there and the silence made you hear things that would haunt you for years. A man's femoral artery doesn't care if you're shaking. It just bleeds. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. Ashley closed the cabinet and stepped back into the hallway, her scrubs moving without sound against her body. She had learned how to walk like this too, like she wasn't taking up space, like her presence was something to be apologized for rather than occupied. The night shift at Mercy General was skeletal. Dr. Raymond worked trauma on the 3rd floor. Nurses Chen and Okafor were in the ICU. The records room was a dark island in a darker ocean, and no one paid attention to the people who worked at night. She made her way to the ICU. Room 347 was at the end of the corridor, past the rooms where the dying went to be monitored and the recovering went to be forgotten. The ventilator cycled with mechanical precision, a sound like a bellows, in and out, sustaining a body that had been broken 3 weeks ago. The patient's name on the board was Colonel James Mercer, 47 years old, admitted with severe traumatic brain injury and compound fractures from an IED blast near Sanjin Valley. The chart said he'd been sedated since arrival. The chart said his chances of meaningful recovery were 19%. Ashley approached his bedside and did what she had done every night since he'd arrived. She checked his vitals with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Blood pressure, 118/76. Oxygen saturation, 94%. Heart rate, 62. Steady. Stable. Hanging on. She reached down and pulled back the corner of his hospital gown, just enough to see the tattoo on his left arm. Letters. A name. Her name. Or what used to be her name. The ink was old, the lines blurred by years of sun exposure and sweat and the particular where that came from a body that had been through things. The letters read Angel 6. That was what they called her in the 75th Ranger Regiment support element before everything went classified. That was what Mercer called her the day she carried him 3 miles through enemy fire with a sucking chest wound and shattered ribs, her hands doing things hands weren't supposed to do, her voice staying calm when screaming would have been honest. He had been conscious for maybe the last half mile, and he'd pressed something into her palm, a tarnished challenge coin, its surface worn smooth from years of being carried. Delta Force insignia on one side. On the other, the words "In God We Trust." She still carried it. It sat in her locker, in the pocket of the emergency scrub she wore on Wednesdays, and she touched it the way other people touched crucifixes. Ashley traced the scar on her left forearm with her other hand, a puckered colloid from shrapnel that had come close to ending everything. The scar was a fact. A thing that happened and couldn't be undone. She had learned to live with facts. Dr. Gabriel appeared in the doorway at 11:58 p.m. She didn't see him enter. She felt the air pressure change, a presence that made the space around her feel smaller and hotter, the way you can sense a predator in the darkness before you can identify its shape. She straightened without turning. "Working late, I see." His voice was measured. Controlled. The kind of voice that came from a man accustomed to being obeyed. Dr. Gabriel stood in the doorway with his white coat unbuttoned, his stethoscope hanging around his neck like a symbol of authority. He was 51 years old according to the staff directory, handsome in the way expensive things are handsome, with silverware jawlines and the kind of posture that came from generations of being told you were better than other people. His hands were perfectly manicured. Not the hands of someone who had ever done actual surgery, Ashley thought. The hands of someone who had learned to look the part. "Covering for sick calls, doctor." Her voice was soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that said, "I am nobody, please don't look too closely at me." This was the mask she wore at Mercy General, had worn at the last 3 hospitals, had learned to wear so well that even she sometimes forgot what was underneath. Just a nurse. Just someone doing her job. Just someone with no history before 6 months ago, no previous employers listed, no references beyond the minimum required, a social security number that verified only partially because some records couldn't be verified without exposing things that had been officially erased. In the restricted records room. It wasn't a question. Dr. Gabriel stepped into the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. After hours. Without authorization. Ashley met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to acknowledge him. Short enough to show subservience. "I was looking for Colonel Mercer's imaging reports. They weren't in the standard file." "And did you find them?" The lie came smoothly. She had learned to lie the way soldiers learn to breathe, not with stress, but with necessity. "No, sir. I assumed they'd be pulled by medical records in the morning." Dr. Gabriel smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, the kind of smile that happened in the presence of something he had decided was beneath him. He looked at the colonel on the ventilator, then back at Ashley, and she could see the moment he decided something. "Not kindly. You're transferring to day shift, effective immediately. The night rotation won't be sustainable with your current efficiency level. You'll be partnering with the float pool. You'll handle patient support only, no charting, no assessment responsibilities." "Yes, doctor. And I'd appreciate it if you confined your work to the assigned units. Mercy General has protocols for a reason, and they exist to protect institutional integrity." "Understood, doctor." He turned and walked out. The air pressure in the room shifted back to normal. Ashley stood motionless for another 30 seconds, her hand still on Colonel Mercer's forearm, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin. Then she reached down and pulled the challenge coin from her pocket. It was heavy. Solid. The kind of weight that was reassuring because it was real. She held it for just a moment, her thumb tracing the Delta Force insignia the way she had done 1,000 times before, and then she put it back. The colonel's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. In. Out. Steady. Stable. Alive. What she didn't know, what Dr. Gabriel was already texting about as he walked back to his office, was that he had checked the restricted room access logs on his tablet before confronting her. He had seen exactly when she entered and exactly when she left. He had seen that she had been inside for 17 minutes. And he had accessed the surveillance video from the corner camera that caught the last 30 seconds of her standing in front of his research files. She had photographed them. He was certain of it. And that meant she knew. She knew that his grant funding, the $2.3 million he'd secured from the National Institutes of Health based on fabricated trial data, was built on a foundation of lies. She knew that his published results didn't match his actual data by margins that would trigger a federal investigation if anyone bothered to look closely enough. She knew that everything he had built over 17 years of climbing the surgical hierarchy could collapse in the time it took for her to make one phone call. Dr. Gabriel sat down at his computer at 12:04 a.m. and began making calls. First to the staffing office. Then to the chief of hospital operations. then to the 3 members of the hospital board whose children had received preferential admissions to prestigious medical schools thanks to his recommendations and connections. The message was the same each time: refined, professional, absolutely poisonous. Staff Sergeant Ashley Cooper was efficient, certainly. Competent, yes. But she'd been passed over at her last 3 positions. There were concerns about her integration into team structures. Questions about her references. Gaps in her employment history that suggested a pattern of not staying long once certain institutional practices became obvious to her. Wouldn't it be prudent to distribute her assignments across the floating pool immediately, before any institutional relationships had time to calcify? Wouldn't it be wise to rotate her schedule aggressively, nights to days to evenings, to prevent her from developing protective alliances with any particular unit? After all, the last thing Mercy General needed was a nurse who asked uncomfortable questions about data integrity. By 12:30 a.m., Ashley's shift assignment had been changed 17 times. She would work nights on odd days, days on even days, and swing shifts on weekends. She would float to different units rather than settling into the ICU where she had begun to establish herself. She would be isolated in the most efficient way possible, not overtly, but systematically, from anyone who might notice her competence or offer her protection. Dr. Gabriel had learned long ago that the most effective way to neutralize a threat wasn't to confront it directly. It was to make the threat invisible. To scatter it across too many locations and schedules to ever gain foothold or momentum. To surround it with bureaucratic obstacles so suffocating that even excellence became futile. He had no idea who he was isolating. Tuesday morning arrived with fluorescent brightness and the smell of institutional coffee that had been sitting in the break room for 3 hours. 23 staff members filed into the conference room at Mercy General, pulling chairs back with a metallic scrape that echoed off white walls. Ashley sat in the 3rd row, notebook open, her posture the same as always, present but not present, visible but unremarkable. Dr. Gabriel stood at the head of the table in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his hands steepled in front of him like a man about to deliver something important. He started with the budget review. Hospital metrics. Standard Tuesday morning noise that made people check their phones. Then his eyes landed on her. Nurse Cooper. His voice didn't raise. That was the thing about Gabriel, he didn't need volume. Walk me through the pharmacokinetics of vasopressin in septic shock. Current protocols. The room shifted. People stopped scrolling. Ashley set her pen down with deliberate care, meeting his gaze for exactly 2 seconds before answering. Vasopressin binds to V1A receptors on vascular smooth muscle, causing vasoconstriction. Half-life approximately 10 minutes. In sepsis, used at 0.03 to 0.04 units per minute as a backup agent when catecholamine-resistant hypertension develops. Titrated down as blood pressure stabilizes. She delivered it without inflection, clinical precision, the kind of answer that would have impressed any attending. Gabriel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Contraindications for thrombolytics in acute MI. Give me 3. Active internal bleeding. Recent intracranial hemorrhage. Aortic dissection. Mechanism of action for heparin. Potentiates antithrombin 3, inhibits thrombin and factor ZAR. He continued for 4 minutes straight. Clinical questions firing like rounds, each one designed to expose a gap, to find the moment when she'd hesitate or stumble. But Ashley had spent years in forward operating bases where a medication error meant someone died. She didn't hesitate. Her answers came precise and complete, each one delivered in the same flat tone. The room had gone completely silent. Pens had stopped moving. 2 residents sat frozen, watching a nurse systematically dismantle the setup they'd all witnessed. Gabriel's voice dropped even lower. "And where did you complete your nursing degree, Cooper? I don't recall seeing it on your file." This was the trap. The one he'd been building toward. This was where he expected her to apologize, to become small, to make herself easier to destroy. Community college, Ashley said. Houston Medical Institute. Not everyone has the privilege of Johns Hopkins. The words hung in the air like smoke. Someone actually gasped, a sound so involuntary it seemed to escape before anyone could catch it. Gabriel smiled. Cold. Calculated. A smile like a shark showing teeth before the strike. That much is evident. The meeting dissolved 15 minutes later. People gathered their folders with nervous energy, speaking in the low voices of animals sensing something dangerous in the room. Ashley remained seated, writing something in her notebook that had nothing to do with the meeting. She was thinking about Kandahar. About the medic whose leg was shattered by shrapnel, 3 miles from the pickup zone, and how she'd carried him across her shoulders with his blood soaking into her uniform because stopping meant both of them died. She'd finished that walk. She could finish this one too. That same afternoon, the schedule changed. Ashley saw it posted on the unit board at 2:47 p.m. Her shifts rotated. Monday through Friday, day shift 1 week, nights the next. 3 different units. ICU Tuesday and Thursday, Emergency Department Wednesday and Friday, Surgical Recovery on Monday. No consistency. No partnerships forming. No one would know her well enough to predict how she worked, to see her as anything other than the transient nurse from the rotation pool. Gabriel had started moving pieces on the board. The elevator confrontation came 4 days later, Thursday afternoon at 4:18 p.m. Ashley stepped in on the 3rd floor, heading to the parking garage. Gabriel was waiting. She didn't know that, she couldn't have known, but the doors had barely closed before she felt the shift in air pressure. He was already inside, blocking the back corner, and his hand came up to press the emergency stop button before she could register what was happening. The elevator lurched to stillness. The fluorescent light overhead hummed with that particular frequency that made the back of your teeth ache. "You've become a problem," Gabriel said. His voice had that quality of someone who'd rehearsed this, who'd calculated the optimal words the way he calculated drug dosages. "I've been patient. I've given you opportunities to prove yourself. But the reality is that you don't belong here." Ashley stood with her hands loose at her sides, her weight balanced, her eyes fixed on a point approximately 2 inches above his left shoulder. The kind of stare that makes people realize they're not actually being seen, not seen as human, anyway. Seen like they're an obstacle being assessed. "Your bedside manner is pedestrian," he continued. "Your surgical knowledge is pedestrian. Your entire educational foundation is pedestrian. And then there's your behavior. Appearing in restricted areas. Asking questions about things that don't concern you. Making my colleagues uncomfortable." He paused, letting that land. "Nurses like you are interchangeable parts in a system that requires excellence. You understand that, don't you?" 90 seconds. He talked for 90 seconds without pause, his hands gesturing with surgical precision, his voice never rising but his contempt absolute. Ashley listened with the same expression she'd worn in villages where one wrong word could trigger an ambush. Her jaw was set. Her breathing was shallow and controlled. She was cataloguing everything about him, the way his left eye twitched slightly when he lied, the way his hands trembled just at the fingertips when he was angry, the way he had to press his back against the elevator wall to maintain his posture. When he finally stopped for breath, she moved. "Your hands shake during rounds now," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not loud, but the kind of quiet that fills a room like pressure. "Everyone's noticed." She reached past him, her arm crossing the space between them like a blade, and pressed the emergency stop button again. The elevator lurched back to life. The door slid open on the 2nd floor, where a nursing student and 2 orderlies stood waiting to board. Ashley stepped out without looking back. The doors closed behind her with a pneumatic hiss. Gabriel remained inside, his hands in front of him, trembling. Friday morning she opened her locker to find the message. Red spray paint. Clinic reject. Large letters. Crude but effective. The kind of thing that was meant to humiliate, to make her small, to give her permission to disappear. Instead, she photographed it. 3 angles. Perfect lighting. Clinical documentation. The kind of evidence someone takes when they're building a case. One of the nursing assistants watched from down the hall, whispering to another, probably thinking she was upset, thinking the paint and the words had landed exactly as intended. Ashley spent 15 minutes cleaning it off. She used hospital-grade solvent, working methodically, her movements precise and unhurried. The paint came away in strips. She cleaned the metal until it reflected the fluorescent lights again, then she deposited the soaked rags in the hazardous waste bin and closed the locker door. The only visible sign she'd even read the message was the photograph stored in her phone's secure folder. Dr. Gabriel pulled her file on Saturday morning, accessing it through his administrative credentials while sitting in his office at 6:34 a.m. The employment history was sparse. Nothing before 3 years ago at Mercy General. No references beyond the minimum. A social security number that traced back only to that same 3-year window. It was the file of someone manufactured, someone who'd appeared from nowhere. He called his contact at the VA, or administrator he'd met at a medical conference and cultivated over drinks, the kind of man who understood that $5,000 in cash could solve certain informational problems. The file arrived by encrypted email at 9:47 a.m. Ashley sat in the surgical supply room that evening, her hands moving through the inventory with the same methodical precision she used for everything. 22-gauge needles. Surgical suture in various gauges. Trauma shears with her initials engraved on the handle, a small thing, a small risk, but she kept them because they felt like part of her spine. At 11:23 p.m., her phone buzzed. Gabriel had made the calls. Every available surgeon had been redirected or marked unavailable. The on-call rotation had been reassigned. And in room 347, the colonel's right leg had begun to swell. She knew what was happening before she checked the monitor. The pressurized tissue. The way his foot was beginning to purple. The clinical inevitability of compartment syndrome that would steal his limb in hours if no one intervened. She'd carried him 3 miles through Kandahar. Through fire that came from 3 directions. Through heat that made the air shimmer like something alive. She'd carried him because he was hers, part of her unit, part of her responsibility, part of the code that said you don't leave anyone behind. The message to Marcus was simple: if anyone asks, you never saw me tonight. Then she walked toward the surgical supply room, toward the emergency fasciotomy kit, toward a decision that would change everything. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, indifferent to what came next. Saturday night. 2 nurses on the ICU floor. Mercy General was bleeding staff, a winter flu burning through the hospital like wildfire, and the on-call list was a graveyard of cancellations and no-shows. Ashley moved through the darkness of the corridor with the economy of motion that came from 18 years of muscle memory, checking each monitor the way a sniper checks her sight lines. Present. Aware. Ready for what the next few hours would demand. Room 347 was the last stop before the nurse's station. The colonel lay sedated under a single overhead light, his left leg swollen from knee to hip. Not the normal post-operative swelling. This was different. The skin was stretched tight, almost glistening, the compartments of the leg visibly tense beneath the surface like a balloon pressed to its limit. Ashley pulled his chart. Compartment pressure had been logged at 2:15 a.m., 62 millimeters of mercury. Critical. The normal range was below 30. Dr. Gabriel's handwritten note sat at the bottom of the most recent entry, conservative management pending morning assessment. Surgical intervention not warranted at this time. Waiting until morning meant waiting too long. Ashley had seen compartment syndrome in the field. She knew what happened when pressure built unchecked in muscle tissue. The tissue death started fast, the necrosis spreading like a betrayal through living muscle, the window to save the limb closing by the hour. By morning, the colonel's leg would be dead tissue in a living body. Amputation or sepsis? Maybe both. She paged Dr. Sterling first. Orthopedic surgery. The phone rang in the surgical call room, 3 times, 4 times. No answer. She tried his cell. Straight to voicemail. She paged Dr. Hayes. Vascular. Same silence. Then Dr. Conrad. Then the general surgery backup. Then the resident on call. Then the trauma attending. 7 pages. 7 dead ends. The pattern wasn't random. This was deliberate. Gabriel had made calls, she understood the mechanics of it the way she understood how an ambush was set up. He'd contacted each surgeon personally. He'd explained the situation. He'd made sure they all understood that answering her page would mean going against the chief of surgery. In a hospital hierarchy, that was a death sentence to your career. She stood in the hallway outside room 347, the monitors soft beeping the only sound besides the hum of the ventilation system. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that sickly institutional white. She was 4 hours from sunrise. 4 hours from the morning shift arriving. 4 hours from official channels, from attending physicians, from protocols and chain of command. But that wasn't what she was really counting. The colonel's leg could tolerate compartment pressure above 60 millimeters for maybe 6 more hours before the muscle started to die. After 8 hours, amputation became inevitable. His ETA to irreversible damage was around 10:15 a.m. Sunrise at 6:47 a.m. The gap was closing. Ashley walked back to the surgical supply room. Her badge opened the lock. She had access everywhere on this floor, a privilege that was about to become a liability. The supply room was cold, organized with military precision. Shelves of sterile kits. Equipment labeled and logged. She found the fasciotomy kit on the 3rd shelf, sealed in clear plastic, the contents visible: scalpel handles, sterile drapes, electrocautery pen, syringes, irrigation equipment. The label read, "For emergency use only. Authorized personnel only." She signed the log, noting the time as for 12 a.m., and carried the kit back to room 347. She locked the door from inside. The sound of the lock engaging was like a grenade pin being pulled, irreversible, committed, no walking it back. Ashley laid out the kit on the bedside table with the same methodical arrangement she'd used in a field hospital in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. 18 years ago. The colonel had been bleeding from an IED fragment that opened his femoral artery. She'd had no surgical team. No attending. No backup except her training and 2 soldiers holding pressure on the wound while she worked. She'd saved his life that day with supplies scavenged from a medical bag and hands that didn't shake because shaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. This wasn't so different. Just quieter. Just 1 patient instead of 4. Just the colonel instead of 12 wounded soldiers waiting for a bird to land. She prepped his leg with antiseptic solution, marking the incision line along the lateral compartment. The mark was precise, a line that surgeons would recognize as textbook anatomy. She pulled on sterile gloves. The rubber snapped like a small whip in the silence. She opened the scalpel handle and positioned the blade. The overhead light caught the steel. She'd done this procedure maybe 9 times in country. 9 times in a war zone with mortars landing 2 kilometers away and her hands steady as surgical lasers. She cut. The scalpel opened the skin in 1 clean stroke. No hesitation. Blood welled immediately. She used gauze to clear the field. The fascial layer was underneath, the white connective tissue that contained the muscles, holding them in a rigid compartment. She could feel the pressure even through the incision. The tissue was under tension like a balloon about to burst. She made the second incision through the fascia, opening the compartment lengthwise, and the pressure released with a soft exhalation of fluid. She worked methodically, a hand spreading the incision wider, allowing the swollen muscle to decompress naturally, monitoring his vitals on the monitor beside her. His blood pressure was steady. Oxygen saturation holding at 97%. Heart rate stable at 68. Pain is data. That's what the senior medic had told her in Kandahar. Pain tells you what's wrong and how fast you need to move. But this wasn't about pain. This was about preventing the pain that amputation would bring. This was about keeping the colonel walking. She irrigated the fasciotomy site with sterile saline, flushing away the debris and inflammatory fluid that had accumulated under pressure. The procedure took 2 hours. 120 minutes of focused attention, no glancing at the clock, no thinking about what happened next, just the work in front of her. Open the compartment. Relieve the pressure. Monitor the patient. Make sure the blood flow returned to normal. Make sure the tissue stayed alive. By 4:47 a.m., the temporary closure was complete. She'd packed the incision with sterile gauze and secured it with gentle dressing. The colonel's leg perfusion was pink now instead of mottled purple. His compartment pressures would begin normalizing immediately. The tissue would survive. The muscle would recover. He would keep his leg. Ashley disposed of the surgical kit in the medical waste container, peeling off her gloves and dropping them in the biohazard bin. She updated his chart with clinical notation that any surgeon would recognize as expert-level work. She noted the exact time of the procedure, the findings, the intervention, the post-operative status. She didn't write her name. She didn't explain. She just documented what she'd done with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. She unlocked room 347 at 4:52 a.m. and walked back to the nurse's station as if nothing had happened. The monitor showed his vitals were stable. His oxygenation was good. His heart rate was normal. There was no emergency. There was no crisis. There was just a patient sleeping off his sedation with a newly decompressed leg that would heal instead of die. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Gabriel arrived at 5:47 a.m., exactly 2 hours after she'd finished the procedure, carrying a folder of documentation that was thick enough to be used as a weapon. Security was with him. 2 guards in grey uniforms. And Linda Chen from HR, the woman who'd hired Ashley 3 years ago, who'd written her positive performance reviews, who looked at the folder in Gabriel's hands like it contained evidence of a crime instead of evidence of a life being saved. Gabriel's voice was calm. Practiced. The voice of a man who'd fired people before and had perfected the art of doing it without raising his volume. Miss Cooper, you performed a surgical procedure without authorization, without supervision, and in direct violation of your scope of practice and state nursing law. Security footage shows you locking yourself in room 347 at 4:12 a.m. The supply room log shows you checked out a fasciotomy kit. The patient's chart has been updated with clinical notes that could only be written by someone with surgical training. He opened the folder. Access logs. Timestamps. Security camera still showing her in the supply room. You've put this hospital at legal and financial risk. You've exposed us to liability that could reach 7 figures. You've violated the chain of command. And you've left us no choice. Linda slid the termination paperwork across the desk. Severance of employment. Effective immediately. For cause. No references. No severance package. Just a folder and a door. Ashley could have told them everything. Could have revealed her background as a Delta Force combat medic. Could have explained that she'd saved the colonel's life because no one else would answer the pages. Could have documented that Gabriel had deliberately prevented any surgeon from being available. She had proof in the form of all 7 unanswered pages. She could have fought this. But fighting meant surfacing. Fighting meant breaking the order from a general whose name she'd never speak. Fighting meant ending the 18-year disappearing act that had kept her alive and kept the people she loved safe. The classification was thick enough to bury anyone who tried to dig into it. The redactions would cover redactions. She could claim whatever she wanted, but her classified file would stay classified. Her service record would stay classified. Her medals and her unit designation and the operation in Kandahar, all of it would stay buried in the vaults of the Pentagon. She signed the papers in silence. She placed her badge on the desk. She opened her locker, the one with clinic reject still faintly visible on the inside of the door after she'd scrubbed it clean, and removed the single item she was taking with her. A tarnished military challenge coin, worn smooth by 18 years of her thumb tracing the Delta Force insignia. The coin that the colonel had pressed into her palm the day she'd carried him 3 miles to the landing zone with his blood on her uniform and his weight in her arms. Security walked her out through the emergency bay. It was still dark. The sun was still an hour away from rising. She passed the ambulance bay and the ED entrance and the loading dock, moving with the same calm efficiency that had carried her through a war zone. She didn't look back. Dr. Gabriel arrived at room 347 at 6:14 a.m. with 2 security guards flanking him like brackets around a sentence that was about to end. The HR director, Ms. Paulson, carried a manila folder thick with documentation. She'd been practicing this walk for hours. Ashley could see it in the precision of her heels, the angle of her shoulders, the way she'd rehearsed her sympathetic expression in a mirror somewhere. Ashley stood at the colonel's bedside, checking his leg compartments one final time. The swelling had stabilized. The incision held. He was breathing on his own. Alive. Staff meetings are over, Dr. Gabriel said. Not a greeting. A statement of fact, the way someone announces a death. Ashley turned. Her hands were steady. Her face was a door with nothing behind it. The folder hit the counter between them. Termination paperwork. 3 pages. She could see the words from 6 feet away, performing procedures outside scope of practice. Violation of chain of command. Immediate suspension pending board review. His signature was already on the 2nd page. You performed surgery, Gabriel said. His voice carried the tone of a man reading a menu he'd already memorized. Without authorization. Without a surgeon present. Without a license. He would have lost the leg, Ashley said. That's not your decision to make. She didn't respond. Couldn't. Because the truth lived in a place that didn't exist. Not officially. Not on any form that HR could process. The truth was that she'd held a medic's license before this hospital knew her name. That she performed field fasciotomies in places where there were no surgeons within 50 miles, where the alternative to action was a body bag. That her hands had learned anatomy in the dark, in the sand, under fire. But saying that would mean surfacing. It would mean breaking the order that still lived in her bones like shrapnel, disappear. Your mission is over. Your service is classified. Your name is no longer your own. The general who'd given that order was someone whose face she'd never seen and whose name she could never speak. That order was the floor beneath her feet. Violating it meant falling into nothing. You're fired, Gabriel said. It wasn't cruel. That would have meant emotion. It was administrative. Efficient. Like closing a file. The security guard stepped forward. Not to arrest her, she was still a civilian, still nobody worth arresting. They were there to escort her from the building. To ensure she understood the weight of the word terminated. Ashley set down her pen. She gathered her badge. She moved past all 3 of them without meeting anyone's eyes, which was what everyone expected from someone who'd just been destroyed. She didn't look at the colonel. Not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't afford to. Because if she looked at him, if she saw the rise and fall of his chest, the blood still pumping through a leg that would have been lost to infection by nightfall, the life she'd bought him at the cost of every credential she'd built in this place, she might say something. She might say his name. Her call sign. The truth. Instead, she walked down the hallway and out through the ambulance bay and past the loading dock. The morning air of Houston was already thick at 6:19 a.m., humidity pressing down like a hand. She kept walking. 2 days later she sat in the Crossroads Diner at 3 a.m., the kind of place that existed only for people who'd stopped sleeping. The coffee had gone cold 47 minutes ago. She wasn't drinking it. She was just looking at it, the way someone looks at the wreckage of a car they used to drive. The reflection in the black window behind her cup showed a woman she didn't recognize. Jobless. Homeless soon, rent came due in 9 days and her severance had been a check for unused vacation hours, $847 that wouldn't cover 3 weeks. Her phone sat on the table beside the tarnished military challenge coin she'd carried for 3 years. 17 missed calls from Marcus, the nursing student. She hadn't listened to any of the voicemails. The coin had a weight to it that seemed impossible for something so small. She picked it up, traced the Delta Force insignia with her thumb, a motion worn so deep into the metal that her skin followed grooves polished smooth by years of this gesture. The colonel had pressed this coin into her palm the day she carried him to the helicopter in Kandahar. The day he stopped being a casualty and became the reason she understood what it meant to move through fire. The night cook behind the counter watched her but didn't approach. He'd seen this before, the 3 a.m. stare, the untouched coffee, the person who'd come here because everywhere else was too loud or too full or required an explanation. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped in plastic. Outside, rain had started. Not falling, hammering. The parking lot was empty except for her truck, 16 years old and paid off because she'd never believed in owing things. What Ashley didn't know was that Marcus had been recording everything. The morning he'd watched her work, moving with precision that no floor nurse should possess. The evening he'd listened to her speak to Dr. Gabriel in the elevator and heard something in her voice shift, something ancient and precise underneath the civility. The night he'd photographed Dr. Gabriel blocking the surgical rotation board, ensuring every attending surgeon had a sudden emergency or a prior commitment. She didn't know that the hospital chaplain, Father Dominic, was a former Army Ranger who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan. That he'd noticed the unit insignia on her jacket lining the day she'd been fired. That he was pulling files and making calls and whispering to security about inconsistencies in her personnel record. She didn't know that the colonel in room 347 had woken up at 7:43 a.m. that morning with clarity in his eyes like someone emerging from underwater, and spoken a single word that would split the hospital in half, Viper. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Ashley Cooper, Staff Sergeant Ashley Cooper, Viper 6, a woman who had saved 12 lives in a place where 12 lives was the only currency that mattered, sat alone in a diner at 3:47 a.m. and drank cold coffee and understood that she'd saved this man's leg at the cost of her own survival. She'd violated every protocol. She'd broken cover. She'd let someone see her work. And in the calculus of her old life, that meant she was already dead. She just hadn't stopped moving yet. The thing about compartment syndrome is that once the pressure releases, the tissue either survives or it doesn't. There's no middle ground. No recovery. Just a binary, alive or gone. That's what Dr. Gabriel didn't understand when he filled out the termination paperwork. He thought he was just firing a nurse. He didn't understand he was triggering a release valve that had been sealed for 3 years. Dr. Gabriel discovered the truth while building his case for a restraining order. That had been his next move, documentation of her instability, her dangerous judgment, her unsuitability for healthcare work. A restraining order would prevent her from contacting the hospital, the patient, or him. It would be clean. Professional. Bulletproof. He'd bribed a VA administrator named Hendricks with $4,800 in cash and the promise of a $5,000 consulting contract. Hendricks had pulled Ashley's complete employment file on the 4th day after her termination. He'd sent it encrypted to Gabriel's personal email at 11:42 p.m. on a Friday, the kind of timing used by people who wanted plausible deniability. Gabriel had been reading through her work history, unremarkable, sparse, deliberately thin, when he found the classified flag. Not a clearance notation. Not an administrative hold. A classified military file that existed in a different database entirely. The kind of file that required a security clearance he didn't have. The kind of file that made your computer screen display a warning, unauthorized access prohibited. Continued attempts will be reported. He'd stopped reading immediately. But he'd read enough. The redacted summary, in its sparse language, had burned into his memory, Delta Force designation. Operation Neptune Aegis. Kandahar Province, October 2019. Service dates aligning with, redacted, S deployment. The dates matched the colonel's timeline exactly. They overlapped. They connected. Dr. Gabriel understood, in that moment, that he'd made a mistake. Not a professional one. Not an ethical one. He'd stopped believing in ethics a long time ago. He'd made the mistake of pushing the wrong person. Of selecting a target that turned out to be something else entirely. He closed his laptop. He deleted the email from Hendricks. he decided not to proceed with the restraining order. Instead, he'd simply wait. Eventually, she'd get another job. Another hospital. Another place where she was nobody. He could move on. He could forget. It was the only mistake he'd made, and it would be the one that ended everything. The Colonel's eyes opened. Not the unfocused flutter that had haunted room 347 for 3 weeks. Real eyes. Tracking eyes. The kind of eyes that see. His mouth moved, and the words came out rough as gravel through a broken transmission. Wraith. The monitor beeped once. Twice. Then silence filled the ICU like something solid. Nobody moved. Not the night nurse checking his full line. Not the respiratory tech adjusting the ventilator settings. The name hung in the fluorescent white air, a call sign that shouldn't exist outside classified briefings and redacted documents, and the memories of 12 soldiers who had sworn never to speak it aloud. Wraith, he said again, stronger now. His eyes were searching the room, searching the ceiling, searching the corner where the machines hummed their mechanical vigil. Where's Wraith? The night nurse pulled her phone out to call the attending, but the ICU chaplain was already moving, Father Marcus Halloway, who'd served with the 75th Ranger Regiment before collar insignia replaced rank tabs. He'd heard the call sign before. Once. At a funeral in Arlington, spoken by a general who thought the room was empty. Father Halloway moved to the Colonel's bedside and saw it then, the ink on his left forearm, barely visible beneath the hospital bracelet. A name. A set of coordinates below it. 39.9207 degrees north, 68.1921 degrees east, Kandahar. The chaplain's hands went steady. He'd worn the same unit insignia once, stitched inside the collar of his dress uniform, the one hanging in his closet at home. The insignia that marked him as Delta. That marked the Colonel as Delta. That marked Ashley Cooper as Delta, though nobody at Mercy General knew it except the man lying in this bed, his brain finally finding its way back to clarity. "He's looking for me," the chaplain said quietly, and the night nurse understood without understanding. She stepped back. Father Halloway sat on the edge of the hospital bed, and what happened next traveled through Mercy General like current through copper wire. He reached for the unit insignia hanging beneath his collar, the one he never removed, not in 3 years of ministry, not in 1,000 services and confessions and last rites. He held it where the Colonel could see it. The Colonel's eyes flooded. Not tears yet. Just that moment before tears, when a man's entire face becomes an apology and a recognition and 1,000 unnamed things at once. "I know her," Father Halloway said. "I know exactly who you're looking for." The ICU erupted. Not with noise but with the absence of it, that particular silence when people understand they're standing at the edge of something classified, something sealed, something that was supposed to remain buried. The nursing students who had witnessed the exchange scattered toward the nursing station, but too many people had heard the call sign. Too many people had seen the chaplain's insignia. A visiting admiral, Admiral James Hartwick, pediatric surgery consultant from Naval Medical Center San Diego, had been walking the corridor conducting rounds. He heard the call sign drift from room 347 like a ghost asking permission to manifest. He stopped. His pace changed. A man who had spent 34 years in the Navy learning the topography of classified operations had just heard a designation that meant something in the language of Delta operators and black site briefings. He changed direction toward the ICU. When he stepped into room 347, the chaplain turned, and the two men recognized each other in that wordless way that military men do, across rank, across service branch, across the invisible lines that separate people who know what it costs to carry someone else's weight. "Wraith," the admiral said. Not a question. A confirmation. He stood at the foot of the Colonel's bed, and his voice carried through the ICU with the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak with authority in rooms where classified things were discussed. "Bronze Star," he said, and let that settle. "Silver Star." 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. Each medal was its own sentence. Each one marked a moment where Staff Sergeant Ashley Cooper had chosen something other than survival. The ICU staff heard the names of honors they'd never seen documented, never seen recorded, never seen acknowledged anywhere in Mercy General's systems because the systems didn't contain the truth about her service. The colonel's eyes closed then, and when he opened them again, they held something like peace. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Gabriel. That wasn't even close to the worst part. A man in a grey suit arrived at Mercy General 40 minutes after Admiral Hartwick's entrance to room 347. He didn't check in at the main desk. He didn't need hospital credentials. He walked past security with the kind of calm that comes from being the type of man that security systems are designed to accommodate, not question. His name was Richardson. That wasn't his real name, but it was the one he used in civilian hospitals. He worked for a division of the Central Intelligence Agency so compartmentalized that most agency analysts didn't know it existed. He stood in room 347 and listened to the colonel speak the call sign twice more, listened to the admiral recite decorations that didn't exist in any official record, and he made a decision that had been made 17 times before in his career, that sometimes the truth was less dangerous than the lie. He looked at Father Halloway and Admiral Hartwick, and he spoke in the kind of voice you use when you're confirming something that was never supposed to be confirmed. Wraith was her operational designation, he said. CIA Asset, Special Operations Direct Action Support, 2019 through 2022. Kandahar Province Theater. Mission code name, Midnight Meridian. Every record of her deployment is officially classified and will remain so. The chaplain nodded. The admiral nodded. The colonel's eyes had closed again, but this time in something like relief. Richardson turned to leave, and as he passed the nursing station, he saw the video. A nursing student named Marcus had recorded Dr. Gabriel's elevator tirade, the moment when Gabriel had backed Ashley into the corner, blocking the doors, describing her inadequacies in that measured, vicious tone he reserved for people he believed were beneath him. 90 seconds of footage showing a surgeon at full authority, using that authority like a weapon, his hand steady, his voice cruel, his absolute certainty that he would never face consequence. Marcus had uploaded it to a medical ethics forum. From there, it had traveled to Reddit, then to Twitter, then to the inbox of Dr. William Carmichael, Gabriel's medical school mentor at Johns Hopkins, a man who had once told Gabriel, "You are the most gifted student I have ever taught. Don't waste it." By the time Richardson was leaving Mercy General, Dr. Carmichael was sitting at his desk in Baltimore, watching the video for the 4th time, his hands shaking badly enough that he could barely type. The letter took him 40 minutes to write. When it was finished, he sent it to the Johns Hopkins Medical Alumni newsletter with a carbon copy to Mercy General's board of directors. 48 hours later, it had been shared in 4,200 professional forums. His voice, his credibility, his authority, his decades of respect in the cardiac surgery community had disowned his greatest protégé. A surgeon's skill means nothing without character, the letter read. I demand a full review of every research paper bearing his name, every grant he received, every patient outcome he reported. The board responded within 48 hours. They opened a file. They asked the data analysts to examine his research trial results, the same ones Ashley had photographed in the restricted records room at 11:47 p.m. 3 weeks earlier. The investigators found falsified statistics, manipulated data, ghost authorship on papers that had generated $4.3 million in grant funding from pharmaceutical companies and the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Gabriel's medical license was suspended pending investigation. His wife filed for separation. His name was quietly removed from the donor recognition wall in the surgery wing, a wall where his contributions to the hospital had been engraved in stainless steel that now caught the light like an empty frame. 11 days. That's how long it took for the entire structure of his career to collapse into something unrecognizable. He sat in his office on day 12, looking at his hands, trembling badly now, unable to hold a pen steady enough to sign the settlement documents his lawyer had prepared. The tremor had gotten worse. Fear does that. The fear that follows when a man realizes he has targeted someone who exists in a category he didn't know existed. 6 months later, Dr. Gabriel stood in front of a classroom at Houston Community College, leading a CPR certification session for bored undergraduates who didn't know who he was and wouldn't have cared if they did. He earned $18 an hour. His hand shook as he demonstrated chest compression technique. Students complained about his impatience, his bitterness, the way he made simple concepts sound like accusations. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Pearland, divorced, blacklisted from every major hospital system in Texas and most of Louisiana. His former colleagues didn't return his calls. His medical school mentor had never responded to his apology letters. He existed in that particular hell of the professionally erased, breathing, moving, speaking, but functionally invisible. Meanwhile, the executive wing of Mercy General's administrative suite smelled like fresh paint and the particular silence of spaces designed for people who make decisions. Ashley Cooper stood in that silence, shaking hands with the hospital's CEO and board chairman, accepting the position of director of emergency medicine. Her office overlooked the ICU. In her pocket she carried the tarnished military challenge coin, the one the colonel had pressed into her palm in Kandahar 3 years ago, his hand shaking as he pressed it into hers, his mouth moving around the words "You come back, you give this back in person," and she had come back, and now she held this small weight of metal and history and promise kept. The challenge coin surface was worn smooth from 3 years of her thumb tracing the Delta Force insignia, the minute she'd escaped the restricted records room, the minute she'd stepped into room 347 with a scalpel kit, the minute she'd accepted termination rather than betray a classified oath. Her thumb had found that coin 10,000 times, maybe more, the way a rosary finds your hand in the dark. The press release described her as a decorated combat veteran whose dedication to patient care exemplifies our institutional values. She didn't give interviews. She didn't appear in the hospital newsletter. She simply moved into her new office and began the work of reshaping the emergency medicine department, removing protocols that prioritized liability over judgment, hiring nurses who understood that sometimes the bravest decisions were the ones that broke the rules for the right reasons. The colonel attended the acceptance ceremony, walking with only a slight limp now. The fasciotomy had saved not just his leg but his mobility, his ability to move through the world without the constant weight of phantom pain. He saluted her formally when she entered the room, and she returned it, and nobody in that room understood what they were witnessing except the 4 people who already knew, the chaplain, the Admiral, Richardson in his grey suit, and the 2 of them. During her acceptance speech, Ashley said only this: protocol exists to protect patients, but judgment exists to save them. I'll always choose the latter. Later, when the ceremony had ended and the congratulatory conversations had faded, she sent a text to Marcus, the nursing student, "Thank you for recording everything." He responded 3 minutes later, "My mom always said, do not pick a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose." Ashley read it in the privacy of her new office, her thumb on the tarnished challenge coin, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Then she put the phone away, opened her email, and began reading the applications of nurses who had been fired for choosing judgment over protocol at hospitals across the country. She had work to do. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.